Hello and welcome to Salon London's live streams for lockdown. These salons are designed to help us really spend a bit of time, grapple even with the big ideas of our time. And tonight we're looking at the truth. So of course we were going to turn to a philosopher to help us. So those of you who have been to Salon London or Salon North or have seen us also before will know that we're big fans of this particular philosopher, Julian Baggini. And that's because what we find with Julian's approach is he's really able to take these ideas and academic ideas and philosophical ideas and kind of make them understandable and within reach and accessible, but without dumbing them down at all. It's quite a feat. He's also a fantastic writer. In fact, his book, Short History of Truth, the research and the writing of that sort of underpins this session tonight. But his book on philosophy and food, Virtues of the Table, won Salon London's Transmission Prize and is a real favourite of ours. He also, last year, his book on a global history of philosophy, How the World Thinks, did phenomenally well. So we really are in good hands. Now the structure works a bit like this. I'll be talking to Julian for about 20 minutes, half an hour maybe, about the kind of different types of truth that exist, which is the basis of his book. But if you have any questions, do text them in at any time. The number is on the screen and I can pick them up, and then at the end I'll be putting questions to Julian. So this is a very interactive session. It is your time as well with Julian, so please do text in. So it now remains to say hello to Julian. Julian, one book I didn't mention. Hello.
Hello, Helen.
Hello. One book
Thanks for having me again.
Oh, it's lovely to see you. One book I didn't mention in my introduction, and when I was getting ready for tonight, it really sort of jumped out at me because it's such an unusual thing for a philosopher to do. And that was the book you wrote, I think, back in 2006, 2007, Welcome to Every Town, A Journey into the English Mind. And in order to write this book, you moved your entire life. You sort of relocated to a small town or village outside Rotherham for 6 months to see if you could find out more about what it was to be English, the inside of the English mind. And I just wanted to ask, as it is truth tonight, did you find out any big truths about the English mind by your Welcome to Every Town project?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It was. I mean, what the premise of the book really was that philosophy doesn't. We have a philosophy that informs our way of thinking, whether we're aware of it or not. Most of the time, it's implicit. We all carry around assumptions about what truth is, what values we have, and so forth. So I wanted to sort of like look at what the English one was. And I think the biggest truth, and I think it has turned out to be a truth that I found, was that really the country is kind of divided into, in that book, I called them the conservative communitarians and the more cosmopolitan liberals. And the conservative communitarians are the people of the small towns and the countryside, who are conservative with a small c. They like tradition, they like order, they like settled, they're very proud of place, locality, nation, and so forth. And then the liberal cosmopolitans are the people tend to be more in cities, university educated, see themselves more as citizens of the world and so forth. And I say that's back in 2006, and it's actually been quite interesting to see that sort of divide really erupted around Brexit and is now kind of taken to be common sense almost. It wasn't at the time, I can assure you. So yeah, it was very interesting to do.
It really is, and I think people are reading a lot more at the moment, which is which is a really sort of a really good thing to hear. And I think you have written so many books, but that one is so interesting. And I think almost kind of where we are now, having experienced everything we have with Brexit, to go back and read it, and and how it just seemed so. Such an unusual divide that you really called. It's such a fantastic book. I wanted to recommend that.
Thank you.
That's all right. That's all right. So tonight we're going to talk. I know in the book there are 10 areas of truth that you talk about. We won't get to talk about all 10 tonight, although we can take questions on all of them. But we're going to talk about a few of them, maybe 6 or 7, and kind of walk around different areas of truth. So. Actually, I suppose I should ask before we start, give us some context. Why did we need a book on truth?
Well, I mean, it seems like a long time ago now, but I mean, post-truth was the Oxford or Collins Dictionary Word of the Year a couple of years ago. And there was all this talk about the post-truth world. and a lot of kind of nonsense being talked about truth. And it was a very interesting moment, really, because people were talking about post-truth as a bad thing, and very evidently a bad thing. And yet, of course, not so long ago, postmodernism was very fashionable, particularly in academia, but also in the arts and in culture, as kind of celebrating the fact that there's no such thing as the truth, that there's only what's true for you and what's true for me. And there's something inherently kind of imperialistic and almost arrogant about ever claiming that anything could be the truth. And then we had this sort of post-truth moment where people were suddenly thinking, well, hang on, everyone's just making it up as they go along. And this isn't a liberatory movement. I think a lot of the people who were behind postmodernism, they thought this as being a kind of a liberation, because the way they saw it, for example, a lot of like minorities were kind of basically kept in their place by the truths, in inverted commas, that were being put out by the authorities. So they thought, this liberation of the truth was be a political liberation. It turned out to be pretty much the opposite, which is that actually once you don't have to establish anything as true or not, and it's just whatever you can get away with, that gave even more power to oppressors and nasty regimes. So I think that was why, people were kind of a bit confused, because people realized truth did matter after all. You can't just ignore it. But had sort of become nervous about ever trying to say anything is the truth for fear of denying someone else's truth and therefore offending them. So it's finding a way of thinking about the truth which would retain that sense of democracy and openness and lack of oppression, but which didn't end up with a truth being chucked out the window, and therefore it becomes merely what the most powerful can get away with.
Okay, all right. I think I understand. We would definitely, we would definitely understand by the end of our session together. And so let's talk about some of the areas of truth. The first one I think that you wanted to talk about was, or we agreed that we'd start with, was authoritative truth. And so I guess the big kind of philosophical question for you is, drum roll here, is what makes someone an authority on truth? Can we agree? What is that? What is an authority on truth?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, there isn't an authority on truth. There are people philosophers in particular, who spend a lot of time thinking about what truth is, and therefore have interesting things to say. You can't really even call them authorities, because they disagree amongst themselves. But there are authorities about particular kinds of truth. Okay. Now, I think that what I try and do in the book is to try and sort of give us a way of navigating through that. How do you arrive at someone who is an authority? Well, the first thing to do is to ask yourself, is the thing that you're looking at actually in a domain where there are such things as truths, right? So there are, I won't name them because I'll offend certain people, but there are certain kind of beliefs and worldviews that people have. They're just simply false. And there are no truths about them to be found, and therefore there can be no authority on it. So if you are a certified, a particular kind of healer, for example, that doesn't make you an authority on that, because there is no such kind of healing. Then you've got to ask, so then you've got to decide, is there something there's any truth to be found about? Are there any experts in it? And this isn't a trivial question. So if you take a field like nutrition, the answer to that is complicated. There are experts on nutrition, but our state of knowledge about the science of nutrition is such that none of them can really claim to be absolute authorities on it. We're still working it out. In a similar kind of way, I think, you can talk about this COVID-19 coronavirus, there are experts, but there isn't an expert who knows everything. And then once you determine there are truths to be known and there are experts, then it becomes a question of which expert to listen to. And then there are various, I think, common sense things to do there around, who is more authoritative. But I think the critical thing at the end of this is always to recognize the fact that no one is an infallible expert at all. And I think this is one of the difficult things we have to negotiate. We have to a certain extent, defer to experts, because we can't be experts on everything. But we're right to be somehow, a little bit skeptical that anyone can just simply tell us what the truth is. And I think this is particularly interesting because in a lot of questions actually involve different areas of expertise. So if you think of some of the things people are trying to understand about this current virus, so for example, what's the way out? What's the exit strategy? Well, there's no expert on exit strategies. There are experts on disease, epidemiology, economics, social psychology, and actually the kind of expertise we need to solve this problem is a kind of a collective expertise. It's bringing together experts in each of the relevant fields and having, as it were, expertise by committee. And I'm kind of a big believer in expertise by committee, actually, because most problems are too complex for any individual to solve. So I think there's a little, there are one or two things in the book which may even be pithy. And I think one of the pithy ones I have is like a little slogan, which is, don't think by yourself, but do think for yourself, right? We're always told we should think for ourselves, and that's true. But thinking by ourselves is ridiculous. We have to kind of bring in expertise. But at the same time, at the end of the day, we always have to use our judgment as to which experts to give more credence to or not, and how to balance that up. So like with a lot of things, there is never a straightforward, simple answer to these things. I mean, the philosophy doesn't bring you those simple rules and principles you can just go and apply. But I think it can bring a greater clarity to help us to navigate and understand things which are inherently very, very complex.
Yeah, that's why you're here, Julian. That's what we're looking for tonight. And it's really funny. So thank you so much for that. And I love your. It's almost like a take home, except we're all at home. So I think it makes it a home, I think. But, I don't want to rush over that because it's easy for you to understand. You've written a book on it. But, this idea of, triage, as you put it, how to work out who to trust as an authority is brilliant. And I just wondered if you could reiterate that for COVID-19. We are, don't get swept. It is, don't get swept away by people who have no authority in this field. But is that right? But choose who you want.
I think that's right. I mean, the thing is, people often want to know what's going on, what's happening, right? Now, step one, is there a truth there? And well, there is a truth there. There are certain things either happening or they're not happening. The virus behaves in such a way or it doesn't, okay? But then you ask, are there any experts in this area? Well, a lot of those things, again, you just got to recognize the fact that although there are truths to be found, we can't expect, unfortunately, anyone to be able to say at this stage with any great confidence what those truths are. So we want to know, for example, if I've had the virus, does that mean I'm immune? Well, there's a truth there, but does anyone know it at the moment? Nobody really does, right? So then you've got to accept the fact that even the experts are finding their feet, and that therefore you've got to kind of cut them some slack. But that's, in a sense, all the more reason to listen to them, because whatever they know is going to have more information, and it's going to be more fact-based than what any kind of commentator might think, or some lunatic who thinks you should drink bleach or something. Or not that anyone like that could possibly get very far in this world. And then which particular experts to trust becomes a very difficult one, because there is conflicting advice. But I think here, the mature attitude is simply to accept the fact that, okay, there are conflicting views, but actually on a lot of the issues, there's a large degree of consensus. But again, it's being prepared for the fact that we might be surprised in next week, next month, next year. We might look back and think, do you know what? There was something about this virus which we just got completely wrong, And I think we need to just accept that. And I think the acceptance of uncertainty actually is one of the things that I come back to in the book many times. It's perfectly consistent to say that there is a clear difference in a particular case between the truth and what's not the truth. And yet, for us, there is a huge degree of uncertainty about what that is. And it's difficult to live with. It's difficult to live with in something that has such serious consequences as this. But it's the only way to live. And in a way, I think you drive yourself mad by looking for the certainty. Although it may seem difficult to accept the uncertainty, if you're desperate for the certainty, you're going to drive yourself crazy because you're not going to be able to find it. And the only way you can find it is to sort of just convince yourself someone's got it all worked out and just hand yourself over to them. That's, I don't think, a wise strategy in the long run.
No, and that really brings me on to a next question, which sort of has an element of conspiracy theories in it, and it's something that I wanted to ask you about. And this, is a kind of something you term as esoteric, big philosophical world there. So this esoteric truths, and I think the big question that I wanted to ask you about is about these, big truths that do make sense when you really, really buy into them, such are conspiracy theories, and especially at the moment, we've got so much access to, such brilliant information, and as you say, we are really able to choose, the best people who've got the best chance of telling us the truth and find this collaborative truth through all these experts. So why do so many conspiracy theories exist and persist?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think it's very easy to kind of just dismiss conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists as somehow they're nutters and they're lunatics. What you often find with people who believe in conspiracy theories is often very, very smart, actually. They're precisely people who have thought about it a bit more than most people and then therefore have got questions. So conspiracy theories emerge partly because there are two things that people who believe in conspiracy theories believe, which are true. The first one is that there are important truths which are often concealed and often deliberately and often, with purpose. I mean, that is just true.
Like,
so, well, I mean, I think, for example, the big tobacco, for example. I mean, big tobacco did hide information linking smoking with cancer for many years, quite successfully. Again, in nutrition, sugar was the sugar industry did very well in burying a lot of evidence around the harmfulness of sugar and claiming that fat was a big problem in diets, for example. There have been also conspiracies around. So, I mean, actually, some of them are not comfortable. So, the McCarthy witch hunts in the US, I mean, they were terrible and they were appalling, and a lot of innocent people were hounded by those. But, it wasn't completely made up. There were people who were members of the Communist Party secretly and so forth who were, caught up in that. So, the problem is you'd be naive to think that there aren't people who are deliberately trying to bury truths for their own interests, right? You'd be very naive to believe that. So a lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories, in a sense, they're taking that first step beyond naivety. They're questioning, which they should be doing, and they're seeing that the world has got a lot of people in it who are deceptive and for their own interests. The problem is, it then takes that bit too far. And I think the thing with the conspiracy theory, if you want a good test about whether a conspiracy theory is plausible or not, what you find is the implausible conspiracy theories require you to assume a much higher degree of competence and coordination than is actually credible. I mean, if you go back to the JFK shootings, for example, opening that up on the internet, I'm asking for trouble. I'm going to have a huge inbox. Do not email me telling me about your latest theory. But, some conspiracy theories around that would require just an implausible degree of cooperation and coordination and covering things up far higher than is the more plausible explanation, which was if there was a conspiracy, it wasn't permeating the whole of government, So again, just to bring it back to something a little bit simpler, if you like, we shouldn't be naive. We should be skeptical. We should be critical. But we mustn't tip over into what I'd call cynicism. Cynicism is where you kind of just simply automatically and by knee jerk reject any account you're given by any authority or any institution, and therefore always looking for the conspiratorial version of it. And it's keeping that balance, which is skepticism without tipping over into cynicism, which is really, really difficult.
But it's a brilliant way to, it's a really brilliant framework to think about it. You know, if you're appropriately skeptical, so that, you know, as you say, you accept that, you know, not everything that you're seeing is going to be true. And in fact, there may well be people who are organizations, even experts, you know, governments, organizations who are there, who are deliberately misleading you. But it's just not tipping, as you say, tipping over, where you're just rejecting everything from every expert to so that you can protect this theory that you've bought into. That's the advice.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, one way of looking at it is that there are kind of two opposite forms of gullibility. And I think the problem with people who fall for a lot of conspiracy theories is they swapped one form of gullibility for another. So the more common form of gullibility is just to believe whatever you're told without questioning it. And that's kind of false. But the conspiracy theorists, I think, are too gullible about the alternative that's presented to them. So often what happens with a conspiracy theory is there's something which is genuinely a bit puzzling. We can't completely understand it. Something doesn't quite fit. I mean, the whole JFK thing, I don't think it does all quite fit. It's a bit messy, isn't it? But not being satisfied with that, rather than, and I'm going back to this point again, rather than just kind of accepting a degree of uncertainty there, they're gullible about the nice, neat explanation which ties it all together, which is the conspiracy theory, right? So, you know, there's gullibility on both sides, and being able to hold the middle position. And the middle position with truth in general is always that kind of holding the truth lightly, really. It's sort of not being too confident that you can get a complete grip on it and you can be absolutely sure of it. But you do need to hold it. You know, you can't just throw your hands up in the air and say, some things you can, but anything that matters in life, you can't just say, I don't know, shrug your shoulders, because you've got to get on and live your life. And to live your life, you have to decide whether certain things are true or not.
It's quite slippery, isn't it? And, you know,
very.
Yeah, and I think this idea of uncertainty is really interesting. You know, because I think, you know, and this really kind of takes us on to the kind of third area that we want to talk about, which is empirical truth. So we probably need a definition for that, Julian, I think. It's a nice philosophical word. Okay. What do you mean by empirical truth?
Well, it's very simple, really. An empirical truth is one which is based on the evidence. And that might seem, well, isn't all truth based on that? Well, not according to a lot of people in history. A lot of people thought that a lot of truths are based, for example, on divine revelation, on special insight, or by pure reason. I mean, Descartes believed, you know, you could believe that you could prove the existence of the self and the whole world essentially just by steps in logic. Spinoza also thought similar things. So empirical truths are those that, you know, they stand or fall on what the evidence is, and what you can actually examine in the world.
In your book, you describe empirical truth as modest, which I thought was really cute, and it kind of like, you know, a really good way of understanding, you know, how truth is not absolute. And I wondered if you could explain, what do you mean by modest?
Well, by modest, I mean it is the nature of any sort of truth about the way things are based on evidence that you could be wrong, because the evidence is never entirely conclusive. This is actually quite relevant to our current predicament, actually, because people, you know, the government spokespeople are always saying, we are following the best scientific advice, scientific evidence, but as though that means it's just a given, and it isn't. You know, the evidence is always incomplete. The evidence of our senses is in particular highly fallible. I mean, people have believed that they have seen and heard all sorts of crazy things, and, you know, to them it seemed absolutely true, it seemed undoubtable. And yet when we take a detached view, we can understand how we can be deceived even about, you know, things that seem to us really real, apparitions and so forth. But, you know, when it comes to any kind of important truth about the world, any scientist will tell you it's the nature of science that it's provisional. To be a scientist is to accept that someone might come along and show you to be wrong. Now, that actually isn't as destabilizing as you might think, because certain things are so well established that for all practical purposes, you can take them to be true. So, for example, gravity. I'm no physicist, but we know certain things about gravity, which for all practical purposes we can treat as certain. But at a fundamental level, it may well turn out that gravity is not what physicists think it is, or it's not as constant as they think it is. And so it's that degree of always being open to being proven wrong, to be shown otherwise, is really important. And if that's true, even in science, which is really, really well tested, when it comes to sort of things about history or about our own lives or about people we know, all the more reason to be modest, because we never know the full facts about that, do we? We never know exactly everything that's gone on in someone's life and so forth. So yeah, that's what the modesty is about. It's saying I try to base my beliefs about what is true on what the best evidence is, but the best evidence is always incomplete. So again, I'm going to hold those truths a little bit lightly. I'm going to kind of accept, I'm going to be prepared if someone comes along and tells me or shows me something, which means I have to kind of say, okay, not so true after all.
Oh, so that's beautiful. Thank you, Julian. So it's helpful to give up on the idea of pure truth, because by its very nature, it just can't be static.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't kind of put it like that. I mean, I'm not sure what pure truth means. I suppose, I think, to be honest, this is more about our capacity to know the truth. I mean, I think that if you just take the difference between what is true and what is false, I think there are lots of things where there's no ambiguity about it in an ultimate sense, but we're always in the position of being imperfect knowers. So I think that's the difference. So with lots of things, there is a truth to the matter, and there's only one truth to the matter in certain cases. But because we're imperfect knowers, we can't sort of presume that we know that, and we can't presume to have that certainty about it. So the modesty is about us as knowers. It's not imagining that the world is fuzzier or vaguer than it really is. It's just knowing that our ability to grasp it all is limited and fallible. Fallibility is such a key thing.
Yeah, I like it. Got it. I've got it. So far, so good. We're going to move on to moral truths. Now, they are a little bit tricky. But I think, about in reading about them, and I think you spoke about this earlier on in your introduction, that, we really seem to be living in a time of, who are we to judge, a sort of position of tolerance. And, isn't that a good thing? I mean, what's wrong with that? Isn't that a tolerant position?
Yeah, who are we to judge? Well, except, of course, that who are we to judge if they want to round people up into concentration camps, or if they want to, it's not difficult to come up with examples where no decent person is going to turn around and say, well, who am I to judge? And actually, a lot of people who make a practice of being very non-judgmental in large areas of their life, you don't have to look very far to see them being extremely judgmental, particularly around political leaders. I mean, Tony Blair came in for a lot of vitriol for his decisions over the Iraq War, and a lot of the people who, just said he was a liar, for example, which is making a very definite claim about truth, in other areas of their life would be like, oh, I don't want to judge, and what's true for you may not be true for me. Now, I think what makes moral truth complicated is there is genuinely a sense in which there are no moral truths. And what I mean by that is, and of course this is contentious, although there are lots of people on my side of the debate, I'm not on any kind of weird fringe on this. I'm kind of with David Hume, the great 18th century Scottish philosopher, who thought that when we say things are right or wrong or good or bad, we're not stating facts about the world, right? What we're doing is we're expressing a kind of attitude towards the world. We're saying this is pleasing, or this is useful, this is helpful, or this is displeasing, or it is unhelpful. Now, that's inevitably involves a certain feeling and a judgment. So I think it's true to say that moral truths are not like scientific truths. Murder is wrong is simply not the same kind of sentence as water is H2O. Grammatically, they look identical, but they're very different. But, and here's the important but, the fact that moral truths do not exist in some kind of eternal realm and we can discover them in that way doesn't mean truth isn't really important for morality. Because actually, when you scratch any kind of moral judgment, you find that behind it is not just a feeling or a judgment or an opinion. There's almost always some kind of view of the world which can be true or false. So I think the simplest example of this is, why do we think that racism and misogyny and hatred of trans people is morally wrong? Okay. Well, it's largely because we think that the things that lead people to believe those things are okay are based on fundamental mistakes. People think that women are, I don't know, less intelligent or weaker or whatever it might be. They believe that certain people are less intelligent or less capable on the basis of their ethnicity. Or they think that, in the case of trans people, I'm not quite sure what they think actually, but they clearly have some kind of view that there's something wrong with them in inverted commas, etc. Now, these things are factually incorrect, right? They're factually incorrect. And having these factually incorrect beliefs leads people to have the wrong moral attitudes. So although I think at the end of the day, if you really push things far, you can never establish a moral position to be true or false in the same way that you can a scientific or historical one. There's a lot of work to be done in making sure that what people base their moral beliefs on are genuinely true. And I'm optimistic that actually when people agree on the facts, they tend also to agree on the morality. So for instance, if you take another hugely contentious moral issue like abortion, the reason people take different moral views on that is largely or often because they have a different view about what kind of thing an early fetus is, whether it is a kind of full human being, whether it has a soul, or whether it's still an emerging cluster of cells. When people agree entirely on what kind of thing the early fetus is, the zygote is, they don't tend to disagree on the morality of abortion.
Ah, and so that's what, and so that's really fascinating. And so, is that what you mean when you say that when we change our minds, we should change our hearts?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. I mean, it's very interesting that a lot of philosophers of the past actually had moral views which we'd find repugnant. I mean, Aristotle was a misogynist. Most of the great philosophers of the past were men, and most of them were misogynist. A lot of them were racist as well. And I think the point is that, does that undermine them completely? Well, they were right about so many things. How could they have been wrong about that? Well, they made some simple mistakes. So Edith Hall, for example, who recently wrote a book about Aristotle, she brushes aside his misogyny quite quickly, because she says Aristotle was someone who always respected the facts. And she was convinced that, given half an hour with Aristotle today, being shown the facts about what we know about the differences between the sexes, there's no way, given his overall position, he would continue with his misogyny. So I think that's true. Often it's changing our view of how things are changes how we feel about them and how we feel about them morally. Because I think people get very scared when you talk about morality as being some kind of feeling, but it's too big a question to go into today. But I do think fundamentally morality only gets off the ground because we have a certain, what Adam Smith called a moral sympathy for other people. We're able to kind of empathize with other people and therefore to understand that it's bad for their lives to go badly, and we have an interest in it not going badly, we have an interest in it going well. That's not logic, that's emotion, that's feeling.
Oh, thank you, Julian. And great mention of Edith Hall there. I love her book on Aristotle. Another great one to read if people are looking for things to read at the moment. I've got a couple more questions before we go to questions. Thanks so much for people texting in. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in, a few on conspiracy theories. So I actually wanted to ask a more sort of link what we were talking about with conspiracy theories to your area of holistic truths, which is another area of the book. And I wondered if, a good way to kind of understand holistic truths was for you to tell us a bit about Henry M. Morris. Would that make sense?
Henry Morris.
Yes. And he's
I'm terrible with names.
sorry.
I don't know names of relatives.
Sorry, the young Earth creationists and their approach to holistic truth. I wondered if that might be
Well, okay. Before we go on, thank you for everyone who's tuning in. By the way, Helen gave me a very generous introduction, and I do try to sort of like make these things as clear as possible. But it's I have to concentrate. It means that I'm sure you have to too. So thank you for sticking through it if you're still there. No, holistic truth. Okay, so here's the basic idea at the bottom of this. Holistic. It's not about holistic in a sort of a vague spiritual way. It's that throughout the history of philosophy, there have been lots of people who have believed that it is possible to, as it were, build knowledge on a secure foundation. And that sounds like common sense, doesn't it? If you want to know what's true, start with something really solid and certain and build on that. That's the kind of approach of Plato and Descartes. And I actually think one of the lessons of the history of Western philosophy, at least, is that enterprise is doomed. There's nothing you can latch onto which is secure enough to be the foundations for the whole edifice of knowledge. And so rather, the way to understand truth and knowledge is, in modern parlance, a theory of coherentism. It's about how it all fits together. So in other words, the reason we believe certain things to be true and certain things not to be true is not because we can trace back our justification to some clear and evident basic principle. It's that the whole makes much more sense if that's also true. So, science is like this. I mean, science is a good example to come to with truth because it's been so massively successful. But, no particular theorem in science makes sense in isolation. It makes sense because it fits in with a view of the world, which the rest of science helps fill the gaps of. And because together it's so coherent, therefore we take it to be true. So it's how things all fit together, which basically tells us what grounds we have for believing something. Now, the thing about that is, going back to the young Earth creationists, is that it makes it possible, if you are determined enough, almost to believe anything, because all you need to do is to keep adjusting all your other beliefs to fit it, right? So, people think it's obvious. I've met some really smart young Earth creationists, and it seems counterintuitive. Clearly it's bonkers. Who could possibly believe the Earth was created 6,000 years ago? But if you take as the most powerful truth of all, the revelation of the Bible, which you have other reasons for, then if you're ingenious enough, you can explain everything that a scientist throws at you as being the result of, I don't know, a kind of a cosmic illusion created by God in order to test our faith, or whatever it might be. The apparent age of fossils, for example, is simply that when God created the Earth 6,000 years ago, he created it as though it had been around for billions of years, right? And so, of course, if you dig up bones, the carbon dating says they're older than 6,000 years, because that's what God did. God's all powerful. That would be easy for him to do that. So the fact that we justify our beliefs by the whole package, unfortunately, does open up the door to the possibility that if you're prepared to make enough adjustments to that whole package, you can pretty much believe anything.
And there's no point in looking for the inconsistencies, because you're going to waste your time.
Exactly. It's a fun game, pointing out the inconsistencies, but surely you can't believe this because of that. the clever ones have got some kind of answer to that. And when they finally reach a point where they don't have an answer, they'll simply come back with something which is true, which is, yes, but it's unfair for you to ask me to give this completely consistent account, because there are things in contemporary science that are not yet consistent. Quantum theory is not yet consistent with classical physics. There's a huge inconsistency there. So they just turn it around on you and say, if you're going to demand complete consistency, none of us are there yet. But this to me is the package. And I think what's really, really uncomfortable about acknowledging this is it does kind of point out the fact that in my book on reason, The Edge of Reason, the key message I'm trying to get through there is that there's kind of a comforting belief that if only we follow the right methods, we never have to make any kind of personal judgment about what's true or false or right or wrong. It will simply stand there evident for itself. And I think the point is, you can never avoid having to make some kind of judgment. That doesn't mean, of course, that any old judgment would do. You have to try your hard to make a good judgment based on using your intellect the best you can, based on looking at the evidence as clearly as you can. But it's an illusion to think you can ever completely avoid the element of judgment in belief. Oh. And in a way, to believe that you can do that is a way of avoiding responsibility for what you believe. The fact that we have to make a judgment means that we ultimately have to take responsibility for what we decide to believe or not.
Okay. Thank you. So the last area we're going to talk about before we go to questions was the one you wanted to end on, because you thought it would be the one that could help us most with considering a post-COVID world, and that was creative truths.
Yeah.
So come on, Julian. Leave us on a high with creative truths.
Well, again, a slightly roundabout story. So being creative with the truth generally is a euphemism for lying. And you may remember there was this famous incident during the Second Gulf War, I think, where I think it was one of the advisors to the president turned around and said to the journalist, you people are living in this sort of like old-fashioned world in which there's just truth out there. I'm paraphrasing, but we make our own truths now. That's what he said. And everyone was quite horrified by this. We make our own truths now. But I think the point is, if we think about being creative with the truth as meaning just making up the truth, that's terrible. That's wrong. And people are doing it all the time, and it needs to be called out. But there is actually a really important way in which truth is created. And that's because by what we do, we change what the facts are. We change the facts on the ground. So, for example, it's not just a given truth of the universe how many people are in poverty. I mean, at this particular moment now, it is just a truth whether or not the number of people living in poverty, defined by certain measures. But that is a truth that came into being because of actions that governments and individuals have taken. And that means that what's true from now on is always, and in lots of cases that matter, is going to depend upon what we do. So we really are going to be creating the truths of the future by our actions. So there's a lot of punditry at the moment. What's going to happen in this post-COVID world? How is it going to change us? And I think that some of that discussion is framed too much as though we're trying to sort of like simply describe a process which has a kind of inevitability about it. We're all going to come out of this much more community spirited, and that's just the way it is. And this is a prediction about the future, and it's either right or wrong. Well, actually, I think it's much more important to recognize the fact that whether that becomes true or not depends upon what we do and how we choose to either build on the legacy and make the most of this tragedy, or whether we just sort of like are too much in a hurry to get back to normal life that we forget the things we've learned. So I think it's really powerful and important to recognize the fact that we do create truths, not by just simply stating what we want to be the case and like inventing things, but by our actions.
Oh, it's brilliant. And, and such a great, that is exactly why we wanted to do these live streams, Julian. That's why we wanted to hear from you and as a philosopher to begin to think about some of these things. So thank you so much for that whirlwind tour around. I think we managed to get through 6 of your 10 areas of truth. But your book is available on our site if anyone wants to get a copy
Good,
from us,
yeah.
and we'll post it out to you.
Yes, and do that. Please don't. Please, sorry, I should just say, don't go and buy it from one of those Amazon type things. I think the one thing that people are saying they are doing in this current situation is that they want to support the independent businesses, the local enterprises that they so value and took for granted. But I think people were often saying that before as well, but they lazily log into Amazon because they one-click order and everything. So, let's make an effort to support the people who really need the support.
That could be a new truth for all of us. Okay, right. I've got a question from Molly. And this is, if something is said often enough and loud enough, does it become some people's truth?
Okay, so thanks, Molly. God, now, sorry, I'm just sounding like David Cameron or what's his name, Nick Clegg. Also, thanks, good question, thank you, Molly. It sounds insincere now because it's been done by them. But anyway, I'm not them. I mean, no, thanks.
You're not insincere.
Does it become their truth? I think there's a kind of there's an ambiguity in the way we use that phrase. I mean, clearly people do have their truths, by which we mean they believe it to be true, so it is true for them in that sense. But I think the point is we shouldn't be shy of just simply pointing out that the fact that something is true for you is not the end of the story, and it doesn't give you an automatic right to just believe that and assert it. If what is true for you is based on a mistake and is false, and particularly if it's pernicious, then the fact that it's true for you is, in a sense, not that interesting. It tells me something about where you currently believe, but it's not a particular reason to respect what you have to say. I mean, sometimes I can be a bit cruel or blunt, but sometimes I'd get in discussions with my mother, who was a deeply unphilosophical person, and sometimes, of course, talking to me, it was like terrible. I feel very sorry for her having to talk to me, having that temperament. But sometimes you say, I have a right to my opinion, and I would say yes, and someone has a right to be a pillock if they want to. A bit rude to say to your mum, but it's true. You have a right to be an idiot. You have a right to believe something without any kind of evidence, but you don't have a right to have that view respected, and you certainly don't have a right for other people to, as it were, act in such a way as to respect that view if the consequences of doing so are harmful, such as it's true for me that drinking bleach is a good cure for coronavirus, or whatever it might be. So it becomes true for people in the sense they become convinced it's true, but that's the start of the story, not the end of it.
Okay, thanks, Julian. Thanks, Molly. Got another question from Deborah. Hello, Deborah. Julian, is truth about facts or the interpretation of facts?
Thank you, Deborah. Good question. Is it about facts or well, it's about both, isn't it? I think it's about both. And then the reason for that is that I think that things have to start from the facts. If you're not starting with the facts, you're rubbish in, rubbish out. Okay, if you don't start with the facts, then you're not going to end up with the right view. But there's always interpretation required, almost always, because actually, life is not a trivial pursuit game, right? Simply being able to say fact, true or false, doesn't really get you anywhere. We're interested, the facts we're most interested in are the facts that have some relevance for what we ought to do. And then, you've always got to interpret. That's where interpretation comes in. So, for example, there are facts around mortality rates of certain diseases. There are facts around, what certain treatments cost, etc. But then the interpretation, if you like, comes with, well, what do we do about that? Because it just doesn't follow. It never follows straightforwardly from the facts what you should do about them. you know, one of the debates going on at the moment is about, you know, costs to the economy over costs of treating this illness and dealing with it. And also, that's not just a crude thing about making money. It's about, you know, quality of life and about the long-term effects on death and mortality if we do these things. So I think it's possibly a slightly long-winded way of getting there, but I think the key thing here is that, you know, people say the facts speak for themselves, and actually that's almost always not true. The facts don't speak for themselves. We need to decide what to do with them and how to interpret them, and that is an important thing. So it's both. We need the facts and the interpretation of the facts.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Got a question, and kind of relates back to every town, and is really interesting. It's from James and Rebecca, who are in Ibiza. Hello, James and Rebecca.
Okay, lucky you.
I know.
Well, unless you're stuck there against your will, against unlucky. Yeah.
So I think this is Rebecca, actually, and she says, on several occasions, non-native English speakers have pointed out to me that the British language is full of clever ways to conceal the truth of the meaning that the speaker is trying to deliver, with, you know, layers of indirect meaning and sarcasm which is not apparent in other languages, such as Spanish, which is a very emotive and honest language in its delivery. Does language in itself convey a cultural approach to truth?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, actually. On the Spanish issue, I lived in Spain for a couple of years after university teaching, and although I didn't get that great at Spanish, I kind of felt different speaking Spanish, and it did feel like more directly expressive, as it were. You know, and that's partly perhaps because I didn't speak it that well, so maybe it had to be that way. There's a very big debate about the extent to which language shapes the way we think, and it's one of those things where there are kind of extreme positions, and in a rather, what might sound like a disappointingly bland way, I think the truth is somewhere between those extremes. There was this thing called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which was very, very fashionable, I think in the 80s, which was that, you know, language actually set almost absolute limits on what you could possibly think. So if you didn't have the words in your language to think certain things, you just couldn't have those thoughts, right? And the problem with that theory is that thought develops. Somehow people are able to have new thoughts, and they find new words, or they change old words to do them. So it's not literally the case that language is a straitjacket, but language does, as it were, provide a framework for the way you look at things, which places certain constraints on your thought, or alternatively, places certain opportunities. So, for example, there are certain languages whereby you can't express a thought without giving a gender to those things. And in other languages where you can express the thought without expressing a gender. And that makes a difference to how you approach it. It doesn't mean that you literally can't make someone in one language understand what the other person is thinking, but there are those kind of framings. There are also things around tenses, interestingly enough. I think in Chinese you can express things in which the tense isn't necessarily given. I could be wrong about that, but it may be other languages. So the point is that our language, as it were, draws our attention to certain things which other languages may not draw our attention to, and similarly can take our attention away from certain things that other languages do. So a simple example of this is French and English. In English, we have the word to know, and we use, but in French you've got savoir and connaître, right, and savoir-faire. So in French, there's you wouldn't think of knowing how to do something and knowing a piece of information as being the same thing, because the language separates them. Whereas in English, you've got to make kind of an effort to distinguish them, but we can distinguish them, so we're not entirely constrained. So the middle of the road answer there is yes, language sort of points us in certain directions. It tilts the balances. It makes certain things more natural than others. But fortunately, I don't think there's an inevitability about it. People are capable of thinking the same things in many different languages.
Thank you. Hello, James and Rebecca. We've got a question from Olbin here. Hello, Olbin. Julian, you say conspiracy theorists might be gullible, but isn't it often linked to a kind of paranoia in which we need to believe our own negative specialness? For example, that if a great deal of thought and deceit has gone into tricking us, we must be very threatening and important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, in a way, I'm tempted just to let that sort of stand as a suggestion. I think that generally speaking, I'm quite reluctant to speculate about psychological motives people have for believing what they believe, right? Now, that's not because I don't think the psychology is important. It's almost the opposite. I think that if you want to understand why people believe what they believe, often having some insight into their psychology, their emotions, their character is at least as important as understanding what they present to you as officially the evidence. The problem is that people are so complicated and so diverse that it's very sort of like dangerous to sort of speculate too much about what those psychological motives are. And I think that one of the bad legacies of Freud on the general culture is that people have kind of adopted this view that if you really want to understand what people think, the most important thing you should think about are the motives, which are probably hidden even to themselves. And that kind of encourages us to think that actually we know people better than they know themselves, and we can plumb people's souls in ways that no one really can. So it might sound contradictory to say that our psychology and character and personality and history is really important to what we believe. But I think we should be much, 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 much more cautious about trying to sort of guess or think we've worked out what they are. In practice, we do better by engaging with what people actually say, because that's something at least we can agree, both parties, on what that is.
Amazing. Thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you. I think this is going to be our last question, actually, from Hannah. Hello, Hannah. And it's a really interesting one, I think, to end with. And this is Julian. So how, with emphasis on the how, do we live with uncertainty? I'd love some advice. I think we'd all love some advice.
Right. Well, the last question. Good timing. Look, just at the bottom of my mind there. How do we live with uncertainty? Well, this is something where I think psychologists have also got lots of good advice, as well as philosophers. Aristotle and Confucius both were great believers that habit is the great kind of guide to life, really, and habit is really important. And it might sound glib, but I think the best way to live with uncertainty is to get used to it, right? It's a bit like, for example, accepting mortality. A lot of people grew up believing that there was life after death, and some people do believe in life after death, etc., etc. But if you've become convinced that this is the only life we have, and you're uncomfortable about that, in a way, the only way to overcome that, or the most important way to overcome that, is simply to sort of like not run from that thought, but to keep thinking of it and keep reminding yourselves about why that may not be terrible as well. It's important to have a story about why it's not terrible. So I think that with uncertainty, you need to sort of have at your disposal certain sort of things you can remind yourself about why this isn't terrible. Uncertainty is actually the price we pay for the possibility of discovering anything about the world at all, actually. So uncertainty is inevitable. It's not disastrous. Just because things are uncertain, it doesn't mean that we don't have better reason to believe some things than others. And accepting uncertainty also is a good way to becoming more flexible and adaptable. Because if you have very fixed views and they get broken, your sort of world shatters. If you get used to being with uncertainty, you become a more flexible and adaptable person. So you can remind yourself about why it's not such a terrible thing that things are uncertain and might be a good thing. And then I think you simply try to get used to it. You get into the habit of it. And I think that over time, you just do, and what seemed terrible, oh my God, nothing's uncertain, ends up just becoming a very natural fact about the world, and you just live with it and you get on with it. So practice is the answer. Practice living with it, and yeah, that will work, I think.
Thanks, Hannah. That's a great question, and brilliant one to end on. Thanks, Julian. Fantastic answer. Thank you so much for your short history of truth. It really was superb. Just want to say thank you so much from all of us. And I'd like to say thank you to Julian, of course, and thanks to our Salon members that are watching tonight. Thank you for being there. Quick hello to my mum and dad in Yorkshire, if that's all right. And I'd just like to, Julian says hello too. And I'd just like to mention we are doing an Also Festival, a digital version of our Also Festival, which Julian has been to for many years. And it's going to be in May the 15th to the 17th. We're going to be attempting to do an entire festival over that weekend, including wild swimming. Please join us if you'd like to. We're also going to be doing some more of these big ideas live streams over the next few weeks, and also our book clubs where we all come together to have a book club together. So please be part of the Salon community. And as I mentioned, we are selling Julian's book, A Short History of Truth, on our webpage, on our Salon London webpage. So please do buy it from us. I'd love to take down Amazon, but probably shouldn't say that on film. So this salon, thank you so much, and this salon is now closed.